to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any other elders who are here today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that in this strange new Zoom world, we are zooming out onto the lands of many different language groups across Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the elders of the lands that your device is on, and to pay my respects to them as well. This is Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I'm very grateful to be here continuing a storytelling tradition that has been happening for millennia on this land. Now, if you are new to the Zoom world, there are a couple of things that I'd like to mention. One of them is that you have two views. That's normally in the top right-hand side of the screen. There's gallery view or there's speaker view. So feel free to toggle to the one that you'd like. I do recommend the one where there's a full head on screen speaking, because it's easier to see what's going on that way. The other thing is, if your computer has any problems, any glitches, and you're dropped out, just re-click on that link that I sent you, and I will let you back in. So I'll be here watching and I'll let you back in. And also the chat function is at the bottom of the screen, and that chat function, you can actually ask me questions at any point in the event. So the chat function, which I was just about to put a link to the book and realize that I've actually put a bio in that link. So I'm just deleting that at the moment. But once I've done that, I'm going to just say hello through that chat function so that you know where that is. And at any point in the event, if you have a question, just type it into that chat function, and I will get the questions, and then at the end for about 15 minutes, we will be able to help you. Now that's a long bio, so it's going to take me a little while to remove it. So I'll do that later. I'll give you the chat function later. In the meantime, I'll let some more people in. And there we go, joining now. Right, it's morning. I haven't had my second coffee yet. I'm glad you all got the link. Great. So it's really exciting to have this event this morning, and to thank you all for joining us. We do have a discount code if you're shopping online with us. So that discount code is going to be EVENT, E-V-E-N-T. I will send that through the chat function in the middle of the event so that you get the event code and the link to the book. So you can purchase that book, and any of your purchases will have a 10% off for the next 24 hours. So that's my bookseller duty for 24 hours. If you put the word event in at the checkout, you will get 10% off all of the books that you've purchased for the next 24 hours. So thank you very much for joining us this time in the morning. Now, I'm just going to introduce our guests to you. Firstly, well, we are really here because of Jennifer Ackerman, and she has been writing about science, nature, and human biology for almost 3 decades. Her most recent books include Sex, Sleep, Eat, Drink, Dream, A Day in the Life of the Body, Chew, The Uncommon Life of the Common Cold, which, you know, is an adjunct to what we're all living through now, slightly different kind of bodily functions. Chance in the House of Fate, A Natural History of Heredity, The Genius of Birds, and Birds by the Shore. A contributor to Scientific American, National Geographic, The New York Times, and many other publications, Ackerman is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship in Nonfiction, a Bunting Fellowship, and a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So welcome to Jennifer Ackerman. Welcome.
Thank you.
And talking with Jennifer today is the wonderful Harry Sadler, who is back in lockdown in Melbourne. So any other Melburnians here, solidarity. Harry Sadler is the author of The Eastern Curlew. We both know 10 Stories About Relationships and Small Moments. His writing about the ecological, physical, and philosophical interactions between humans and animals have been published online at Meanjin and the Wheeler Centre, and in The Lifted Brow, and formally at his blog. He was a joint winner of the 2014 Melbourne Writers' Festival Blurb Blog to Book Challenge, resulting in the book Not Bird Watching, Reflections on Noticing Animals. He was twice shortlisted for the Lifted Brow Prize for Experimental Nonfiction. Everybody welcome the wonderful Harry Sadler. Hello,
Thank you.
Harry.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Over to you.
Thanks, Chrissy. And thanks so much to Chrissy and Arid Reader for asking me to do this. It's a real pleasure to not only get to talk about birds, but to get to talk to about birds with Jennifer Ackerman, who I've admired since I read the Genius of Birds, and it blew my mind, really, to be honest. As Chrissy said, I'm in Melbourne, not so marvellous Melbourne, just at the moment, um, which is Wurundjeri country, and it's located within the Kulin Nations. And as Chrissy pointed out, we're going out to many, many Indigenous nations, potentially all around the world. And I want us to keep that in mind because we're going to be talking a lot about science in the next hour, which is one of my favourite things. I studied biology at the Australian National University. But it's important, I think, to note when we say the word science, we're usually only talking about one specific scientific tradition, which is the Western scientific tradition. But there are other scientific traditions too. Science, when you boil it right down to the basics, is deduction through observation. And of course, Indigenous people have been observing the world around them for a long, long time, tens of thousands of years in the case of the Australian continent. Often, if you'll read a news story that describes a particular species of animal as having been newly discovered, if you read the story in more detail, you'll find that what it actually means is newly discovered by Western science, but more often than not, that species was known to the Indigenous people who live in that area where it's found, and they've always known about it. Jennifer, we're going to get to talking about birds very soon because they're the stars of the show. But it strikes me that your book is as much about people, and there's an undercurrent running through it of how Western ornithology is expanding its understanding of bird behaviour and of the world's birds, because it's also expanding the range of people it listens to about those birds. There's a really lovely example you cite about ravens in the Northern Hemisphere and about how they've recently been accepted by Western science to be playful, but there's also an Indigenous creation myth in the same region that says that a raven created humans because it wanted someone to play with. and so the Indigenous people have always known that ravens are playful. But because this event is being hosted in Australia, I'd love it if you could tell us a bit about an Australian story, which is the story of firehawks.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Chrissy, for hosting me and for the lovely introduction. And thank you, Harry, for being here with me. I'm a big fan of Harry's writing, and I encourage everyone to read The Eastern Curlew. So yeah, I completely agree that, you know, until recently, Western scientists really had little use for, you know, anecdotal evidence or observation. They were insisting that, you know, data had to be replicated or manipulated statistically, and observation wasn't enough. But that is all beginning to change. And I think a lot of the really exciting new insights about birds are coming from this kind of shedding of old biases and perspectives. And a very good example of that is the firehawks of Australia. Now, these are birds like brown falcons, whistling kites, black kites, and they are known, have been known for a very long time to intentionally spread brush fires to flush prey. So it's really remarkable behavior, and it's showing us that birds actually use fire as a tool to rustle up food. You know, raptors around the world. They hunt at wildfires. They feast on all the mammals and the snakes and the little critters that flee from the flames. But it's one thing to feed at a fire that's already raging. It's quite another to start one yourself. And it appears that these Australian raptors seem to be doing exactly that. They're flying into active fires. They're picking up smoldering sticks and then dropping them in unburned grass and brush. And that spreads the flame to new areas and provides new feeding for them. Now, this behavior has been recognized by Indigenous peoples of Arnhem Land and other regions of the Northern Australia tropical savanna for a very long time. And it's also been noted by non-Indigenous fire managers and anthropologists, but it really has never been documented to the satisfaction of Western ecologists and biologists. So two people, an ornithologist, Bob Gosford, and an ethno-ornithologist, Mark Bonta, gathered this wonderful array of evidence from Indigenous fire rangers. And it was really impressive documentation of what is just truly startling behavior. Now, we thought we were the only species the only species to use fire as a tool. And so this new science really is behavior that's largely described from anecdotal and indigenous knowledge, which, you know, as Harry has pointed out not so long ago, it might have been dismissed entirely.
Yeah, and that's interesting. As I said in my intro, I studied biology at the ANU, and that was about 20 years ago now, which is not that long ago, really. And even then, the idea of anecdotal data or anything like that would have been just dismissed thoroughly, let alone the idea of complex animal behaviour, such as manipulating fire. Um, I'm curious though, do you know um, the brown falcon, the whistling kite, are fairly common birds of prey in Australia. The black kite is a very cosmopolitan bird. It's found in many, many places all over the world. For instance, often if you watch a cricket broadcast from India, you'll see in the outfield, instead of gulls, they've got black kites flying around.
Right.
I've seen them in Hong Kong. They found it. Do you know if this fire spreading behaviour is unique to black kites in Australia, or do
Well,
we
this
not
is
know?
a really interesting question. So these two researchers are looking at gathering anecdotes now from around the world, because one of the arguments of Western scientists has been, well, this behavior has never been observed anywhere else. You know, why would these birds be doing this here in Australia? Well, there are now anecdotes turning up in other parts of the world. And also, there's some evidence that this may be a learned behavior, and so that it would spread socially in a local population, and it might have been, you know, learned by some birds in another part of the world, and then that ability was lost. There's just a lot of ways that you could explain, you know. The other thing is, you know, the I think it's very likely that the birds are doing, some black kites and other species are doing this in other parts of the world, but nobody's been listening to the you know, indigenous people who have
Yeah.
been observing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on that subject of nobody listening to particular people, it's not just Indigenous communities, and you've got a really lovely example in the book about how basically it took female scientists to break through and to sort of break down the idea or the myth that only male birds sing. Um, you know this line in the book, early in the book, that until quite recently most ornithologists were men, and research tended to focus on what male birds were up to. Um,
It's
so
true. You know, it's the part played by female birds was, you know, pretty much ignored or downplayed at least. And you know, it really came out in on the question of bird song. You know, here in Australia, fair in Australia. You know, you have a lot of duetting of bird species, and that, you know, they're male and female singing. But in North America, it was really believed for a very long time that it was only males that sang complex songs, and that, you know, female birds just didn't sing so beautifully. And it took this team of international women scientists to really overturn that long-held theory that complex birdsong, even in North America, was almost exclusively a male trait. You know, so this team found that in 2/3 of songbird species, females sing, and they sing songs that are just as complex as male songs and used for similar purposes. So it's quite a remarkable kind of overturning of old ideas based on really this influx of women ornithologists.
Yeah, and this sort of bias against the idea of female animal behaviour of any kind being interesting is really, really ingrained and entrenched. I remember when I studied science at uni, I sort of went in first year all very starry-eyed, as thinking science is going to be this sort of great quest for knowledge, and I found very quickly that it's often very conservative and very slow to change its ideas about things, and the ideas being very entrenched. You talk about even in the 19th century, and when Darwin suggested that female animals could drive, and sex selection from female animals could drive evolution, and his contemporaries were outraged and dismissive of this idea of female animals having any kind of significant input into the direction a species might take.
That's right. And, you know, now we've really found that females are the movers and shapers of so many bird traits and behaviors, especially when it comes to plumage and courtship. You know, all of those fantastic courtship displays of males, you know, the weird things that bowerbirds do, and, you know, mannequins with their acrobatic displays, and the whole range, and birds of paradise with their, you know, astonishing diversity of weird and wonderful feathers. All of those things are the result of, you know, sexual selection by females. They're driving these behaviors and these changes in appearance in males.
And there's the great example too of the bird, which will be very familiar to a lot of people in Australia, which is the superb fairy wren. They're the little blue wrens, colloquially called. You know, they hop across the grass, and they've adapted fairly well to urban areas. So you'll see urban parks a lot. There's lots of them here in Melbourne. And they also have, I think, the highest rate of cross fertilization, or of nestlings in any given clutch being sired by a male other than that territory's dominant male. And it was found, I think, probably again around the time I was actually studying, it was found that this was driven almost entirely by the females. So they live in these family groups, and they cluster on a branch, and then before dawn, the dominant female in the territory will wake up and fly across and have a little affair with the next territory's male, and then fly back and nestle into the.
Absolutely, as I say in the book, and before the bakeries open, she's out there getting an extra pair copulation, and you know they assumed that it was for a long time that it was the males that were driving this behavior, but it's the females.
And we're talking a lot about behavior at the species level, as you sort of have to, but it gets a little bit more messy than that. You've got this lovely quote from zoologist Donald Griffin, who said that one must take account of their animals' individuality, annoying as this may be to those who prefer the tidiness of physics, chemistry, and mathematical formulations. It seems to me that biology has traditionally it's had a bit of a chip on its shoulder about being a soft science, so-called, compared to physics and chemistry. And so the idea of taking into account animal individuality or animal minds or animal emotions even has been shunned. It's almost been this taboo topic, because then you gain all sort of soft and squishy rather than being this hard data-driven science. But just as we were talking about biology and ornithology opening itself up to anecdotal data and indigenous knowledge, it's also opening itself up to the idea of animals having an individuality and a mind of their own.
Yes, it's really one of the principles in the book is that the extraordinary diversity that we love in birds is partly about species diversity. There are more than 10,500 different species of birds. There are then also differences in populations of those within those species. And within a population, the individuals vary. And, we never really, we used to think, well, a robin is a robin is a robin, or a fairy wren is a fairy wren. But the truth is that they have great variation, individual variation in intelligence and in personality, and it makes for tremendous, really tremendous diversity within a species group, and you find that there are some individual birds that are really capable of tremendous intelligence and problem-solving ability, and I think, for example, of the keo, which is a New Zealand parrot. And when I visited an aviary, there was one bird named Kermit, who was the genius of the lot. He was the Einstein of the group, and he could solve any puzzle they put in front of him. And the idea really was that if Kermit couldn't solve this puzzle, then there was something wrong with the puzzle, not with the bird. And the other birds would learn from Kermit, and very quickly. They were all quick studies of very intelligent birds, but there is this real variation in personality, and we're just beginning to kind of push at the edges of that, because you're right, it has been sort of dismissed as a soft science, to talk about personality in birds, or individual variation of any kind. So, and the real revolution has been in our new view of the bird mind and what birds are capable of in terms of intelligent behavior. And some of that came out of this idea that was the old idea was that birds had brains that were so small and primitive, they were really capable of only the simplest mental processes, and they were really driven purely by instinct. And now we understand, by looking at the anatomy of the bird brain, that the brains of birds are really miracles of miniaturization. They're dense with neurons, they're highly efficient, and they're really capable of astonishing mental feats.
And it's interesting to use that word instinct, because for so long, pretty much every aspect of animal behavior was dismissed as instinctive. And it seems to me that this word instinct is really just a kind of filler word that we have for any behavior that we don't understand. And we can't explain it. We just say, oh, it's instinctive. And the more we learn about how animals think and how their mind works, the smaller and smaller and smaller this range of instinctive behavior becomes.
That is so true. And you think about something like nest building, which was thought to be a purely instinctive behavior. Birds just had this hardwired in their heads. Well, it turns out that birds really learn how to build a good nest. They learn what materials to use, how much to use, where to locate their nests, and they get better at it over time. So it's not just something that pops out of their brain automatically. The other example that comes to mind is, a bird's ability to navigate. And especially when they're migrating, they have this ability with no GPS or mobile phone to really find their way across tremendous distances, even if they're blown off course, by hundreds or thousands of miles. Birds find their way, and what we understand now is that they actually have mental toolkits that are kind of the equivalent of our compasses, our GPS, and our satellite navigation. And they learn how to do these journeys, through this really complicated process, lots of information funneled into their brains to guide them to their destination.
And every now and then they would get it wrong, because case of shorebirds in particular and migratory birds, the twitchers, which is a more hardcore subset of bird watchers, get very excited because a bird will migrate down the wrong migration path and end up in Australia when it should be in the Americas somewhere.
It's true. It does happen, but think how rare it is,
Yeah,
really. And it's the reason that we all run out to these remote places to see the accidental that happened to show up somewhere, got lost or blown off course. But the very fact that it's rare is what draws us to it. And most birds find their way just fine, even if they're, as I said, displaced by by great distances.
Yeah, and they find their way, in the case of a lot of migratory shorebirds, without parental assistance. I mean,
Exactly.
one of the things that really blew my mind when I was researching the eastern curlew was that the young shorebirds pretty much raise themselves and fly their first long distance migration without any parental guidance at only 6 weeks old.
It's really astonishing. I mean, there's some of that is instinctive. It is genetic. Birds have a built-in clock that tells them when to go and for how long to fly, and also a built-in compass that tells them to fly in a certain direction. But they do learn as they go, and they learn how to process all kinds of information from sun and stars and landmarks and magnetic fields and smells and wind. All those things they funnel into their brains and then use to guide them to their destination.
And well, speaking of taking the wrong track, I could talk about migratory shorebirds for hours and hours, and I have a lot. But I want to backtrack a bit because you mentioned a few minutes ago the Kia, and I think my favourite section in the whole book, in the whole of the Birdway, is the section about play, and Kias feature very prominently in this. So I think, just as a bit of background for people who aren't familiar with them, Kias, as Jennifer said, are a parrot endemic to New Zealand. I think they're the only completely alpine parrot in the world. Is that right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, so they live in the mountains the whole time. To people outside New Zealand, they're probably best known as the parrots that are infamous for destroying tourist cars and tearing them apart.
Stealing their money.
Yeah. I've got, because every time I read about a chapter of the book or a section of the book, I had to pause and look up the bird online to find a picture of it to see what I was thinking. So I've got a picture of the Kia here. I'll put it up in front of the screen and hopefully you'll be able to see it. So that's what it looks like. So I think it's a fairly large parrot, is it?
It is.
Right? With this long bill and sort of kind of khaki green, but then when it opens its wings, there's all these beautiful flashes of colour. But they seem to have, from what you wrote, they seem to have incredible personalities and particularly an amazing sense of play. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about Kias and their playfulness.
Yeah, first I'll say that, play is actually remarkably common in the bird world. All kinds of birds play. Rainbow bee-eaters and warblers and pelicans, they throw things around, throw sticks in the air. And, penguins love to slide down water, ice, like, otters on a water slide. And, people have seen choughs playing, with lying on their backs, passing sticks back and forth. So all kinds of birds play, but Kia are really known as the kings of play, and I have to and they use it for a very unique purpose, which I'll get to in a minute. But I just have to tell you that I really fell in love with these birds when I first met them. When I went to an aviary where they were being studied in Austria. And before I entered the aviary, I was told to take off my earrings and all my jewelry, my watch, my barrettes, everything, because these birds are so exploratory and bold and curious about everything that they will, playfully destroy just about anything you're wearing. So I did, and sure enough, if I were at the bookstore, I would get up and I'd do a little imitation of these birds, because they have this little kind of swagger, and they come up to you and they're just like little children. You know, they greet you like you're the favorite aunt at a family reunion, and they come up at you like, oh, what you bring me? What you bring me? You know, they're just so curious and utterly charming. And they would land on my shoulders and my head, and they'd start snipping away at my hair like they were little, you know, green hairdressers. They're so charismatic and amazing. And they're also very, very intelligent. As I said, they're brilliant problem solvers, but they're best known for just playing, and they play all the time, you know, young and old alike. They tussle, they're always rolling around together on the floor of the aviary. They throw sticks and leaves in the air. They have incredible airplay in the wild that's quite amazing to watch. And they even have a special warbling play call, which they use to draw other kea into play. And when the birds hear it, they just can't resist. They just have to join in the fun. And I have this wonderful video of that was taken in the wild, and a researcher was basically broadcasting the play call to birds in the wild to see what would happen. And he picked a very dreary day in the South Alps of New Zealand. And these birds are just sort of sitting on a railing in the rain. And then the researcher plays this call. And all of a sudden, the birds just erupt into play. They start, you know, fighting with each other and flying around. And as long as the play call is playing, these birds are at play themselves. So it's amazing. And the scientists that think that you know, why is a play call why would a bird have a contagious play call? You know, it's a real puzzle, but they suspect that the birds use it to keep peace in their flocks. So the birds live in the wild in large flocks, and they really coexist in almost complete harmony. They don't ever fight about social status, about access to food. Instead, everyone plays. So, you know, you have a disagreement, springing for that same chunk of fruit, or, you know, vying for social status, warble a play call, you know, and all will be well. It's an amazing social system.
And in the book, you I can't remember if it was you or one of the researchers you're talking to, but the comparison is made between the play call and laughter in human societies is similarly contagious. Like, if one person starts laughing, it's almost impossible not to then likewise start laughing yourself.
Yeah, it's what laughter yoga is based on. And also, you know, small children, they compare the Kia warble with the sort of giggle that happens sometimes in a schoolroom, you know, when one child starts to giggle and then just everybody is, you know, getting into it. This is the way these birds are. They are just like small children.
It's, yeah, reading about them, the comparison I couldn't help making was to the bonobos, the pygmy chimpanzees, which are sort of famous for, instead of fighting to sort out social bonds, they use sex to sort out social bonds. And this seems like every now and then you sort of find a species where it's sort of taking a different approach than the usual, and Keas with their playfulness as a social bonding and social sorting system.
Right.
A really lovely example of one of those. You also mentioned that because unfortunately Keas are also endangered. I think there's only not very many of them in like a few thousand
I
or
think
something in the
it's
wild.
150,000. Yeah. And one of the reasons is because they have been, you know, pretty badly persecuted, because they are destructive often in the wild. I mean, they will take apart somebody's satellite dish, and, you know, they've been shot for that reason. And they often go after the rumps of sheep. You know, they feed on the back of the sheep, and the sheep farmers are not so happy about that. So for a long time, there's been kind of a bounty on Kea, and their populations are struggling. And
and you also mentioned this anecdote of there's a roadway in New Zealand, and I think it's very congested, and there's a problem with the Keas coming up and like investigating and almost getting run over and stuff. And I love that the solution, or maybe you can tell us what the proposed solution was to this.
So these birds, they especially they go after the cars that are waiting in line to go through the Homer Tunnel, and they really are a problem. You know, they'll just pop and just try to pop into somebody's open window, or so this the both the highway people and the scientists got together and said, well, you know, how could we deal with this problem? Well, they decided to create Kia jungle gyms, and to put them away from the road, and you know, make them so interesting and so exciting for Kia that they will go there instead of to the cars to explore. And they're just working on this solution now, and they're submitting they're soliciting ideas from school children and everybody to what would make, you know, what would be interesting for a Kia, and how do we make it fresh and interesting, and, you know, kind of changing all the time to hold their interest.
Yeah, the power of distraction as a management technique is, I think, is something that many parents of young children will be able to relate to.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, so yeah, it's wonderful to hear about Kias. I'd also, because in Australia particularly, we can be quite sort of snobbish about, you know, having all the best birds. So it's nice for us to hear about amazing birds elsewhere. On that note, there's a bird that it makes a small appearance in the Birdway, but it's a real star of your earlier book, The Genius of Birds, which is the black-capped chickadee, and it's a really fascinating bird. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the chickadee.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. These are my two favorite birds, the Kia and the chickadee. And you know, before I discovered the Kia, the chickadee was my top of the heap. It's a very bold, very cheeky little bird, and very intelligent. Has a very large brain to body size.
yeah,
So you look at
so,
these little birds, and they have there's a lot of
so, that,
head there.
so
Yeah,
that's the little black-capped chickadee.
yeah. I mean, and they're just terrific little birds. But the thing that fascinates me about them is that they really communicate in ways that resemble language. So the calls of chickadees are considered by scientists to be among the most sophisticated and precise of any land animal. And you know, like so like other birds, you know, chickadees use their calls to maintain contact with a mate or to announce a nearby food source. But the really remarkable language-like calls they use are the ones that they use to warn of predators. And these alarm calls, they specify both the type of predator, so whether it's arriving from the air or from the land, and also the magnitude of threat that that predator represents. So for example, like a high-pitched seat call, that indicates a threat from the air, like a flying shrike or a hawk. And the chickadee-dee-dee call that gives the bird its name, that warns of a perched predator like an owl sitting in a tree. And it's the number of those little DDDs at the end of its call. Those indicate the predator's size and hence the degree of threat that it represents. So more DDDs means a smaller, more agile, and therefore more dangerous predator. And these alarm calls, they are meant to recruit birds nearby to mob the predator. And the very cool thing is that other species understand the chickadee's language and they join in the mobbing.
Yeah, wow. And in terms of understanding what they mean, you make the point that um, if a bird hears a particular alarm call and responds accordingly by either, you know, going up into the trees if there's a ground threat, or, you know, going into deep bushes if there's an aerial threat, implies not just that they um, understand what the calls mean, but also they have a visual image in their head of what the threat is and what's going on, which is a sort of level of sophistication of thinking
Yes,
and
and that
awareness that we wouldn't have previously been willing to to attribute to birds.
that's right. You know, one of the experiments was done with by a Japanese researcher who's very interested in the language-like aspects of bird calls, and he was looking at how birds respond to snakes, and he really did discover that they carry a visual image of their head of snake, you know, long, thin, wavy thing that, and they will respond to other kinds of, fake snakes in the same way that they respond to a real one. So they are carrying a visualization of a predator in their minds.
Yeah. Now, there's all this talk we've done about bird minds and bird individuality and bird playfulness and bird language. There's this sort of big scary word kind of being the elephant in the room in all this, which is anthropomorphism, which is
Mm-hmm.
one of these ideas that's traditionally been taboo in the study of wild animals. It seems like as long as I've been alive, we've been sort of whittling away at trying to identify what makes humans unique for a long time as well. We're the only animals that use tools, make tools. Now we know that's certainly not true.
Right.
You've got a lovely line in the book saying, "We may be alone in devising reasons why we're special."
Yeah, and that's about it. I mean, you know, birds like
Yeah,
firehawks, chickadees, honey eaters, they're all teaching us that we aren't unique in the ways that we once thought we were. You know, we're not alone in making and using sophisticated tools. We're not alone in communicating in complex language like ways. And we're not alone in passing along cultural traditions. You know, birds do this too, whether it's in modes of song or styles of tool making.
yeah, and we're also not alone in having creches and looking after each other's children. We're running out of time, but
Yes.
we really can't finish without talking a little bit about the greater Arnie because it's
Uh,
such an amazing bird.
It is. It's another of my favorite species. This is a tropical bird, and it has a method of cooperative parenting that is just truly astounding. So,
No,
Anis,
there it is, right there.
yeah, they gather together in groups of up to a dozen adults, and these are to collectively raise their young. And these are not related birds. It's not a family group. These are unrelated birds, and yet they work together expertly. You know, they build a shared nest. They take turns warming the eggs. They looking out for predators and also feeding the young until they fledge. So the question is, you know, how do this many unrelated birds coordinate all of their activities? And it turns out they do it the same way a sports team might. They have huddles, daily huddles. Actually, many times a day, they get together. The birds, they gather in a cluster, kind of like a circle. They point their bills into the middle, and they begin to chorus in unison. And it's this weird kind of collective, gurgly, bubbling, chorusing song. It sounds like boiling water or an outboard motor or something. But scientists believe that the chorusing may actually be how these birds make decisions together. So, where do we build the nest? Who's ready to lay eggs? Who's guarding the chicks tonight? It's really an amazing example of parental teamwork.
Yeah, that's great. And yet it's not completely harmonious because the Arnie that lays the first egg is is in a bit of
Oh,
trouble, isn't it?
yeah, so yeah, it's not all perfect peace and harmony. They until they're all ready to lay, they will, when one female lays an egg, another will come and push it out. If she's not ready to lay, she'll push it out and roll it over the edge of the nest and plunk, it goes down into the water. Once they are all ready to lay, they collectively, and there are like 15 eggs in these nests, that will eventually, you know, and all of these birds take care of the young as if they were their own. There's no distinguishing between one egg and the next or one chick and the next.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, you often see also ducks, for instance. There'll be one sort of mother duck with 50 or so ducklings behind her. She's looking after them for the day, and then they take turns. So so yeah, there's again for a long time we always looked for sort of any kind of evolutionary or genetic reason to explain what seemed to be altruism. Um, yeah, and it seems, I don't know, it seems to me that if birds can behave in all these other ways, then perhaps maybe they can also just behave altruistically for the sake
Yes,
of it,
and
if the going's good. And then
right, there's a great example of this with African gray parrots. There was a recent experiment where the researchers gave, there were two birds side by side, and only one of them could receive treats if it gave the researcher a token. Um, but both birds got tokens. The bird that got the token but couldn't receive the treats gave its tokens to the bird that could. Even though it knew it was not going to get any treat from it, it was just giving away its tokens so that the other bird would get the treats. And I mean, that's pretty altruistic behavior.
yeah,
I don't know how else you explain it.
yeah, it's and that's a really lovely note to wrap up on. We think, as we knew we could keep talking about this for hours, but I think we need to give other people an opportunity to talk if we've got any questions.
We do have some questions actually. So there's a question here from Philip Venables. In Tim Lowe's book, let's just move. In Tim Lowe's book, Where the Song Began, there's a slight suggestion that birdsong may have influenced the development of human song. Has this been assessed any further? And what do we know about bird mimicry, Jennifer?
Oh, the influence of birdsong on human song is really a fascinating topic, and there is some research going on, and some suggestion that there may have been some influence. I think it's one of those things that is very hard to parse. The question of mimicry I go into in a lot of depth in both The Genius of Birds and The Bird Way, focusing partly on the superb lyrebird because it is such an astonishing mimic, but also on other species like the fork-tailed drongo of South Africa. And these are birds that that use their talent for mimicry to deceive. So the superb lyrebird actually lies, uses its mimicry to deceive its mate in a really a kind of astonishing way. And the fork-tailed drongo uses its mimicry to fool that it has, I think, 45 different alarm calls that it can mimic. And these are not just birds, they're mammals like mongooses and meerkats. And what the fork-tailed drongo would do is mimic the alarm call of a particular animal that's feeding. That animal is startled, drops its food, and the drongo just swoops in and steals its meal. So, and it's very adept at shifting the alarm call depending on which animal has the best food. And so quite a remarkable use of mimicry.
That's incredible. There's a question here from Janelle. Janelle has said, my princess parrot and I have been really enjoying your talk. He seems to love Zoom meetings. That's lovely. But as I'm blind, can I get your books in audio format? Oh, I don't know the answer to that.
Yes, you absolutely can. In fact, I narrated The Bird Way myself, and so it's an audiobook, and I think you can get it online. And The Genius of Birds is available as audio as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really great. I'd actually also like to ask about you were talking about how, we looked at male and female birds from our own perspective of having male researchers research them. I wonder whether you think we're looking at birds through a completely human-centric lens, and therefore perhaps we're missing very complex communications which we may not understand.
Absolutely. You raise a really good point, and I think that there has been some progress made in the effort to take a bird's eye view of communication and also of how birds may sense the world. We sort of assumed that they saw the world and heard the world the way that we do, and it turns out that's not the case at all. In fact, um, birds see color in a different way than we do. So, in fact, the researcher, I spent time with a young researcher from Princeton who studies color in the hummingbird, and she said that compared with birds, humans are basically colorblind. Birds have such an enhanced experience of color because of their ability to see ultraviolet light. So it's not just that birds can see wavelengths of color in part of the spectrum that we can't see. It's that ultraviolet light is actually baked into all the colors that they see. So they're experiencing another whole dimension of color that we know nothing of. And it affects every aspect of their lives, from how they forage to how they court. It's really, one of those examples of, well, wow, there's a different world, a perception of the world than we possess.
Isn't
And the
there?
same,
Sorry, no, go for it.
I was just going to say the same is true for smell. This interested me a great deal because we used to think that birds, they had a poor sense of smell, or they didn't smell at all. And now we know otherwise. Nearly every bird tested can detect odors. Pigeons, hummingbirds, robins, finches, starlings, wrens, and seabirds, they can sniff out prey from great distances, and they create in their minds these vast detailed odor maps of whole oceanscapes, and they use them to find the krill and the other sea creatures that they feed on. And puffins have such a incredibly fine sense of smell that they can find their colony by scent alone from like a distance of like 500 miles.
Oh wow, that's amazing. I even today, I keep reading in books, science books, people saying humans are the only species with a sense of our own death and our own mortality. And I keep seeing that coming up again and again and again. I don't know what research people are quoting when they say that, but it doesn't seem right. When I kind of look at your book and books about cephalopods, and other creatures, it does seem that we're not the only people that, think about our future selves and our future life and death.
Yeah, that is one of the big challenges, is how to get inside another animal's mind. And we are really in kind of infant stages of this, of understanding the animal mind, and that what kind of sense of self they have, what kind of consciousness, awareness of, yeah, of life and death. And the one thing I will say is that there have been many examples now of birds surrounding a dead member of their own species and holding what looks very much like a funeral or a vigil. That's a very anthropomorphic thing to say, but there is some acknowledgement of the death, and often a lot of vocalizing around it. And scientists think that this may have to do with kind of information sharing about, what happened here, how do we avoid a similar fate, that kind of thing. But my personal view is that that birds probably do grieve and mourn their dead, especially a mate that they've had a very long-standing bond with. And it may not be mourning and grieving the way that we experience it, but there's something deeply emotional going on there.
Right. I've just asked if anyone has any final questions. We have time for one more, I would say, if there's anything going. If not, I think that
If
this
not,
has been. Sorry, Harry.
I was going to say, if not, I could ask Jennifer to tell us about eclectus parrots, because there's a really lovely example
Oh, yes.
of because
Yeah.
I started possibly getting a little bit stuck into Western science. So eclectus parrots, and why, and particularly why the male and the females are the color they are, I think is a really lovely example of the Western scientific process figuring out and deducing an unusual sort of aspect of animals. So maybe you could tell us about
Yes.
it.
You mean their coloration?
Yeah, the coloration.
Yes.
I've got the photo of these too. So
Yeah, they're
so the male is the green one, and the female is the blue and red one.
right. And they break all the rules when it comes to coloration in birds. These, you know, in most of the bird world, males are flashier than females. Females are often, you know, a dull color because so they blend in with their surroundings when they're incubating their eggs. But with Eclectus parrots, the male is this, as you saw, this really bright grassy green, and the female is this brilliant crimson color. And they're so strikingly different in this showy plumage that for decades, scientists actually thought they were different species. And then some naturalist or others saw a green one on top of a red one and said, okay, these are it's the same species. But it was Rob Heinsohn of ANU who figured out the mystery of their really weird coloring. And it all comes down to the different roles they play and the scarcity of good nesting spots for the parrots. So these birds nest in tree hollows, and they're very good. A good tree hollow is very hard to find. And once a female finds a good nesting hollow, she doesn't leave it for up to 11 months. She'll defend it from usurpers. And so the males come and feed her. And so the roles of male and female have diverged so much. So the males are, the female is the defender, and the male is basically the forager. So they have these completely different selection pressures working on their plumage color. So females have evolved this brilliant vermilion plumage that it's visible for miles and basically screams out to the world, this is my hollow, it's occupied. And males, on the other hand, they evolved a plumage of this kind of rainforest green on their backs, which really offers them camouflage protection from aerial predators. And so they can forage safely for themselves and their mates.
Fantastic. Hey, we've got one more audience question before we wrap it up, and that is from Gloria, who asks, she says, thanks for a fascinating talk. And can you talk a little bit about bird young learning from adults?
Oh, yes, I think this is fascinating. And some of the most intelligent birds in the world have long juvenile periods when the young hang out with adults and learn from them. You know, and my favorite example of this is the New Caledonian crow, which some would argue is the smartest bird in the world. And these, the young have a very long juvenile period. I think it's 1.5 years that they hang out with the adults, and they learn from them how to make and use these really sophisticated tools. You know, and at first the young are very, very poor at it, and they, you know, but they traipse around, and they live on New Caledonia, which has very few ground predators. So they're kind of rustling around on the ground, learning how to use these tools, and modeling their own, both their own behavior and also the actual style of tool making from the adult. You know, the examples of learning, there's also, you know, incredible song learning that goes on between a young bird and an older bird. And, you know, vocal learning is very rare in the animal world apart from birds. And but it's the same process we use to learn language. It involves listening, imitating, and then practicing. And birds use this the exact same strategy that we use to learn language. So there's a lot of learning going on in the bird world.
This has been absolutely fascinating. If you don't all want to race out and buy this book, I don't know what you've been doing. This is just really an amazing world that you have brought to us. And
there's the book, by the way.
There is the book. Great.
Thank you, Harry.
I encourage you all to raise that. It looks beautiful as well. So thank you, Harry, and thank you, Jennifer. This has been the most interesting conversation that I have had since lockdown. I'm really glad to have been a part of this. And what I'm going to do for everybody is in one moment, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves so that we can give Jennifer a round of applause. But just one final thank you to Jennifer and Harry. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Thank you, Harry.
It's been really enjoyable. Thanks.
And now you can unmute yourself and we can put our hands together for Jennifer Ackerman and the Bird Way. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. We can see you all. So thanks, everyone. Hi, Michael.
Bye.
Hi, hello, Paul, Phil. Lovely to see you all. Oh, hello, Elizabeth. Michael's cat has become a regular feature of our events. We'd love to see his case. Gone, I think, but yeah. Thank you, everybody, and good night, and good morning to everyone. Have a great
Yeah,
day.
thank you.
See you
Thanks.
later. Bye.
Thanks, Bridgie.
Bye-bye.